Get out! The words cracked across the wind tunnel like a hammer striking hull plate. Ben froze. His fingers tightened around the small hammer he always carried, the one his father used to let him tap pipes with after work. The cavernous room fell still. 40 engineers, researchers, and grad students turned in unison. A 14-year-old boy stood there in a patched jacket, pants dusted with grit, welding smudge still on his wrist, suddenly the center of a laboratory worth $50 million. Dawn was only just touching the horizon outside. Pale light slid through the high windows and fell across the concrete floor. The tunnel, a monster of steel, long as a boxcar, lay waiting, its warning lights pulsing amber, fans whispering low like some great animal about to breathe. Ben stepped back until his spine met the cold guardrail, and that was when he heard it. A faint tone, high and thin, quivering through the metal. Not the whoosh of air compressors, not the hum of transformers. Something sharper, wrong, a note that had no business being there. F sharp. Clear as a wire singing. Professor Helm stood at the front of the control deck, his face carved with lines of fatigue. This is not a playground. This is a $50 million wind tunnel. Out! His voice wasn't shouted, but the steel door boomed when it closed behind Ben. He stood in the hallway for a long moment. The air smelled of oil and hot dust. When he opened his hand, the callus from hammerwork was bright against his skin. Somewhere behind him, the test team was preparing another run. He thought of his father, still back in the fab shop, welding the final joints of the support frame. His father had never stepped inside this control room. If he saw his son get thrown out, he would just shake his head and say, "Hearing is one thing. Saying it out loud is another. Here they trust graphs, not ears." But Ben knew he hadn't imagined it. That tone was no phantom. It was the same sound his father had taught him to find. Every pipe has a voice. Tap it once. Listen close. The metal will tell you where it's hollow. Through the viewing window, Ben watched as the next test run began. The blade assembly spun up, clamped in its fixture. On the monitor, the numbers climbed. Wind speed, 10 mph, 20, 30. The whole tunnel began to sing, a rising roar that prickled the back of his neck. Then came the note, the same high F sharp trembling through the floor. Ben's breath caught. On the data screens, though, the line was flat. Smooth. Clean. Someone had filtered the graph so aggressively that the little peak, the ghost of the fault, had vanished. "Stable?" called a research assistant. Helm nodded. Only Ben stood outside the glass with his heart thudding. He knew something was wrong. Not in the software, but in the steel. When the fans shut down, the researchers swarmed the test blade. A thin crack had appeared along its edge. Someone swore under their breath. "Another failure," a grad student muttered. "One more week like this and we miss the report deadline. Say goodbye to the grant." Ben stayed until the room emptied, then slipped away. In his pocket, his fingers found the battered phone with the cracked screen. He opened the cheap guitar tuner app and tapped the guardrail once. F sharp lit up in blue. His chest tightened. He wasn't wrong. That evening in the garage, his father wiped the sweat from his brow and laid his welding hammer on the bench. "They really kicked you out?" Ben nodded. "But that tone, it's real. It's right in the frame. If they keep running the tunnel at that speed, they'll break every blade they put in there." His father sat on the work stool, silent for a moment. "Back in the shipyard," he said at last, "we could find a bad weld by the sound it made. But that was a long time ago. These people trust the graph before they trust the ear." Ben gripped the hammer. "Tomorrow, I'll prove it to them." His father studied him, then gave a slow nod. "If you're going to strike, strike true. Metal does not forgive sloppy hands. That night, long after the lights in the admin wing went out, Ben slipped back into the tunnel bay. Maintenance lights glowed cold green. The giant fan loomed ahead, silent as a sleeping engine. Ben started tapping, slow, careful, along each brace and girder. Each sound came back to him, low or high, dull or clear, until he found the one that rang too long. The F sharp again, bright as glass. He marked it with chalk, then another, until a whole constellation of white stars stretched across the frame. At the center, he pressed his ear to the steel and listened until the vibration faded into silence. "What are you doing here?" The voice was deep, close. Ben turned, heart racing. Professor Helm was standing in the shadows, arms folded. For a moment, neither spoke. The tunnel was quiet except for the faint tick of cooling metal. "Tomorrow," Helm said finally, "in front of the entire team, you'll have exactly 5 minutes. If you can point to the frequency that's killing my blades, I will apologize publicly. If not, you're finished here." He turned, the steel door closing behind him with a sound like judgment. Ben stood alone, chalk dust on his fingers, hammer still warm in his hand. 5 minutes. He whispered to the sleeping tunnel, "5 minutes is all I'll need to make you confess." The next morning, the tunnel bay felt different, tighter, as though the air itself were waiting. The control room was crowded, researchers, grad students, even 2 administrators from the funding office. The test blade had been replaced overnight, polished, gleaming under the lights. Professor Helm stood near the console, hands behind his back. Ben stepped into the room. His jacket still smelled faintly of welding smoke. Chalk dust clung to his cuffs. For a second, no one moved. Then Helm spoke. "You have 5 minutes. After that, we resume our schedule." Ben nodded once. He set his father's small hammer on the edge of the console, took out his battered phone, and opened the tuner app. His hands didn't shake. "First," he said quietly, "turn off the smoothing filter." A murmur went through the room. The data tech glanced at Helm, who hesitated, then nodded. The green line on the screen sharpened, every ripple now visible. "Start the fan," Ben said. The great blades stirred. Wind hissed down the tunnel, rising from whisper to roar. At 15 meters per second, the usual graphs appeared. Clean, straight, nothing alarming. Ben closed his eyes, head tilted like someone listening for a far-off whistle. "Faster!" he called. 20 meters per second. The roar deepened. The steel braces began to hum just at the edge of hearing. Ben lifted the hammer and tapped once on the guardrail. The note rang. His tuner flashed, F-ash. "Hold it there," he said. His voice was calm, but the words carried. On the monitor, a small spike appeared. Just a flicker. Then another, higher. The technicians leaned in. 30 seconds, someone called. "Push it 5% more," Ben said. The fans howled louder, the floor vibrating underfoot. The spike leapt upward, sharp and unmistakable. "That's your resonance," Ben said simply. "Frame mode at F-sharp. That's what's cracking the blade edge." Silence fell. The graphs told the truth now. A clean, angry peak no one had seen for weeks. Helm's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Ben knelt near the support girder. From his pocket he took a narrow strip of rubber, cut from an old welding glove, and wedged it at the chalk-marked joint. "Run it again," he said. The fans spun, the wind rose. The same note tried to appear, then died, swallowed. The peak on the graph collapsed like a struck match. The room went still except for the steady hiss of air. No one dared move. Helm reached out and placed his hand on the guardrail. It was quiet, steady. 5 minutes had not yet passed. When the fans wound down, the silence was heavier than the roar had been. Someone near the back whispered, "He killed the resonance." Another muttered, "With a piece of rubber?" Ben stood, wiping chalk from his hands. "You don't need a new blade," he said softly. "You need to stop letting the frame sing itself apart." No one laughed this time. Even the administrators were quiet, staring at the flat line on the display. Helm finally exhaled, a long, measured breath. "Clear the room," he said. The researchers filed out. Ben waited. When the last door shut, Helm turned to face him. His expression was not angry now. It was something else, something close to respect. "I said I would apologize," Helm said at last. He extended a hand, rough from years of work in the field. "I was wrong." Ben looked at the hand, then took it. His grip was steady. For a long moment, nothing moved except the amber lights blinking on the panel, warning that the tunnel was still warm. "You have a good ear?" Helm said. "Tomorrow, you show the team how you found that frequency." Ben nodded. For the first time since stepping into this building, he allowed himself a small smile. "Tomorrow," he said, "the whole frame will sing in tune." By mid-afternoon, the tunnel bay no longer felt like a laboratory. It felt like a courthouse. The hum of computers mixed with the uneasy shuffling of chairs. Ben stood near the back wall, notebook hugged tight to his chest, while Professor Helm paced slowly near the console, a tablet in his hand. On the main screen glowed 6 weeks' worth of test data, row after row of numbers, frequency plots, and vibration signatures. To the untrained eye, it looked perfectly normal. Smooth curves, clean baselines, no surprises. But Ben had learned to distrust perfection. "Come closer," Helm said, his voice carrying across the room. Ben stepped forward. "You said the frame's resonance was there every single run. Prove it." Ben nodded, fingers already flying across the keyboard. The data reloaded in real time, and he scrolled until he reached a column labeled FFT Smooth. "Here," he said, pointing. "The smoothing factor is set to 8. That's way too high." A graduate student near the corner shifted uncomfortably. "We raised it 2 months ago," he admitted. "The raw data was," he hesitated, "too noisy for the funding review." Helm's head turned sharply. "Too noisy or too honest?" No one answered. The room felt colder. Ben took a breath, then tapped a few keys. "Watch this," he said. The smoothing factor dropped back to default. The graph on the screen changed instantly. What had been a flat horizon became a jagged landscape, peaks and valleys, sharp as saw teeth. And there, standing like a solitary mountain, was the F spike. The silence was deafening. "There's your resonance," Ben said softly. It never went away. "We just filtered it out until the computer stopped shouting." One of the sponsor administrators cleared his throat. "This could set the entire program back months. The board will want to know why we kept testing on a frame that was ringing itself apart." "Because the grant review was coming up," muttered another student, almost too quietly to hear. Ben looked down at his notebook, then back at the room. "You were listening to what the sponsor wanted, not what the machine was saying." Helm's jaw tightened. He turned back to the screen, scrolling through more data. Every run showed the same thing. The spike, muted but still there, like a patient whispering its pain while everyone pretended not to hear. Finally, Helm snapped the tablet shut. "Enough. We stop pretending. We log every run from this point forward, no smoothing, no filters." The sponsor rep frowned. "Professor, if this report goes out raw, your renewal could be frozen." Helm turned, his face hard as tempered steel. Better a frozen grant than a broken blade and a false report. We are not in the business of lying to metal. The words landed like a gavel strike. When the meeting broke up, the graduate students scattered in tense silence. Ben stayed behind, flipping open his notebook. Helm stood watching him for a moment before speaking. "You realize what you just did," Helm said. Ben nodded. "I showed them the note." "You showed them more than that. You just forced a retest that could decide the fate of this entire project." Ben closed the notebook slowly. "Then I guess I better be right." That evening, Ben sat on the garage floor next to his father, who was working on a rusted pipe joint for an air compressor. The garage smelled of oil and hot steel. "They hid the data," Ben said quietly. His father set down the wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "People hide things when they're scared," he said. "But a bad well doesn't stop leaking just because you paint over it. The pressure will find its way out." Ben nodded, staring at the hammer lying on the bench. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to make them hear it. Not just see it on a screen. Hear it with their own ears." His father smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came after years of work and disappointment and still finding the courage to keep showing up. "Then strike true," he said. "Let the steel confess for itself." Ben stayed up late that night, copying resonance curves into his notebook by hand, circling the frequencies, sketching where he would place his makeshift damper. When he was done, he sat back and listened to the faint ring in his memory, the F that had haunted him since the first day. Tomorrow, it would sing for everyone. By the next morning, the tension had a weight to it, like humidity before a storm. The department's glass-walled conference room was filled to capacity. Ben had never seen so many suits and lab coats crammed into one space. The sponsor representatives sat stiffly at the far end of the table, laptops open, their expressions unreadable. Helm stood near the whiteboard, arms crossed, face like carved steel. Ben entered quietly, notebook tucked under his arm, hammer still clipped to his belt. No one laughed this time. No one asked why he was here. The silence followed him all the way to the chair set near the end of the table, the smallest one, as if chosen deliberately. Helm cleared his throat. "We are here to decide whether this project survives the week," he said, voice hard. "Our funding report is due in 72 hours. The last 2 test runs failed. The discovery yesterday proved one thing: we have been flying blind. The resonance Ben found has been eating our blades for months." He turned to Ben. "You say you can reproduce the result, that you can point to the exact frequency and neutralize it again under observation. Do you still stand by that claim?" Ben swallowed once, then nodded. "Yes, sir." The sponsor rep leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Professor Helm, we cannot delay this cycle. If this turns out to be a false positive, if we lose another test blade, we're not just talking about losing money. We're talking about shutting down the entire line until next quarter." Helm's jaw flexed, but his eyes never left Ben. "Then we do it properly. No filters, no excuses." The sponsor rep's voice sharpened. "And if this boy is wrong, then I'll shut the tunnel myself," Helm said. "But he gets the chance. 5 minutes. Full speed." Ben opened his notebook and slid it across the table. Inside were hand-drawn sketches of the frame with small circles where the chalk marks had been placed, each one labeled with frequency notes. "I didn't guess," Ben said quietly. "I listened to every joint until I could hum its note. This one," he pointed to the center brace, "was ringing too long. The chalk marks aren't random. They map the vibration nodes. That's why the rubber worked. It didn't just muffle sound, it damped the harmonic." The room was silent except for the low buzz of the projector. The department chair leaned forward. "And you believe you can do this again?" Ben nodded. Yes, if you give me the time. One of the grad students in the back muttered, or maybe you just got lucky once. Helm turned sharply. Enough. This isn't luck. We all saw the spike collapse. He faced Ben again. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Tunnel Bay. Entire team present. You get 5 minutes from the moment the fan spins up. If you succeed, the data will be refilled as truth, even if it costs us the grant cycle. And if I fail? Ben asked. Helm didn't blink. Then you pack up your notebook and go. For good. When the meeting broke up, no one spoke to Ben. The grad students filed past him without a word. The sponsor reps shut their laptops and left briskly, whispering to each other about liability. Helm stayed behind. When the room was empty, he said quietly, "You understand the risk you're taking. If you fail tomorrow, they will blame you. They will say you cost them $1 million schedule." Ben looked down at the hammer hanging from his belt. If I walk away now and the frame tears another blade apart, I'll hear that note in my head for the rest of my life. I'd rather fail in front of them than stay silent. Helm studied him for a moment, then gave a single sharp nod. Then spend tonight listening. Tomorrow you make the frame sing in front of everyone. That night, Ben returned to the tunnel. This time, the guard let him in without question. The bay was empty except for the echo of his footsteps and the faint metallic smell of oil. He climbed the scaffold, notebook open in one hand, tapping each joint with the small hammer, marking any change in tone. At one point he stopped and crouched, pressing his ear to the girder. The hum was there again, low and patient, as if waiting. Ben whispered, "Tomorrow, I let you speak." When he finally left, the chalk marks shone under the maintenance lights like a constellation across the frame, a map of the machine's voice. Tomorrow, everyone would hear it. The tunnel bay was nearly dark when Ben arrived. Only the green glow of the maintenance lights lit the vast room, turning the metal frame into a shadowy skeleton. The security guard at the front desk raised an eyebrow as the boy signed in. "Back again?" the guard said, voice low but not unkind. Ben nodded. "Tomorrow morning is the last chance." The guard studied him for a moment, then reached under the desk and handed him a half-empty thermos. "Coffee. Don't tell anyone I gave it to you." Ben smiled, a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, sir." Inside, the tunnel felt like a sleeping animal. The air was warmer than usual, faintly metallic, carrying the smell of oil and dust. Every footstep echoed. Ben climbed the scaffold slowly, hammer in one hand, notebook in the other. The chalk marks he'd left glowed faintly under the lights like pale stars. He tapped the first joint. The sound came back low, dull, good. He moved to the next, tapping again. This one rang higher, a short, clear note. He scribbled in his notebook, G-Osh, stable. Halfway up the frame, he crouched and tapped the center girder. The note rang too long, F-R, bright, sharp, almost beautiful. "There you are," he whispered. Ben pulled out the strip of rubber from his pocket, cut from his father's old welding glove, and held it up to the light. It looked so small in his hand, but tomorrow it would have to be enough to quiet the frame in front of an entire department. He worked carefully, placing temporary dampers in 2 spots, listening each time until the tone dropped by a half step. Then he removed them again. Tomorrow he would need the frame to sing first, to prove the resonance was real. Around 10 o'clock his phone buzzed, a call from home. He hesitated, then answered. "Still there?" His father's voice rumbled softly. "Yeah," Ben said. "You should sleep. Big day tomorrow." Ben looked down at the frame beneath him. "I can't. Not until I hear every joint. If I miss one, they'll say it was luck." His father was quiet for a moment, then said, "When I worked shipyard night shifts, we used to tap the hull before launch day. Every panel, every seam. If one rang wrong, we stayed until dawn." Ben smiled faintly. "Guess I'm doing the same thing." "Then keep listening," his father said. "And son," his voice softened, "strike true tomorrow. The steel won't lie." Midnight came and went. Ben kept working. He hummed softly to himself, matching pitch with each girder until he could map the entire frame from memory. He drew it out on the last page of his notebook, a perfect diagram, labeled with frequencies and nodes like a sheet of music. When he finished, he sat back on the platform, legs dangling, the tunnel stretching silent before him. He closed his eyes and simply listened. The building was so quiet now he could hear the distant click of the security clock at the front desk. The frame vibrated faintly beneath him, not loud, just enough to remind him it was alive. "You've been trying to warn them for weeks," Ben said softly. "Tomorrow, I'll make sure they finally hear you." At 1 a.m, he climbed down, his hands streaked with chalk dust, his hammer smudged gray. Before leaving, he turned and looked at the constellation of chalk marks one last time. Under the green lights, they seemed to glow, a secret map only he could read. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "you sing. And I'll be listening." Then he turned out the maintenance lights, leaving the tunnel in perfect darkness, as if holding its breath. At 6:55 a.m., the tunnel bay was already full. The fluorescent lights glared against the polished floor. Students stood shoulder to shoulder with postdocs, technicians, and even 2 members of the sponsor board. The air smelled of coffee and metal, like a shipyard at dawn. Ben stood alone near the frame, hammer at his belt, notebook open on the console. His palms were chalky, his cuffs gray. He felt every eye on him, but for once, no one laughed. Professor Helm stepped forward. "We're running a full-speed test, 5 minutes from fan start. If he can identify and neutralize the resonance before time expires, the data stands. If not," Helm's voice cut the air like a blade, "we move on without him." The technician's hand hovered over the start button. Helm nodded. "Begin." The fan spun once, twice, then roared to life. The wind swept down the tunnel, rising from whisper to howl. The first 30 seconds were quiet except for the deep hum of airflow. Ben closed his eyes and waited. At 15 meters per second, he heard it faintly, a high, thin tone. At 18, it became unmistakable, the F that had haunted him for weeks. "Hold speed!" Ben called, his voice cutting through the wind. The technician froze the throttle. On the monitor, a narrow spike leapt up on the FFT graph. Tall, sharp, undeniable. The grad students gasped. This was no guess. Ben crouched near the girder, tapped once with his hammer. Clink. The note rang back, pure and bright. The tuner app in his pocket buzzed confirmation, F185 Hetz. 3 minutes left, called the timekeeper. Ben's hands moved quickly. He pulled the strip of rubber from his pocket. His father's old welding glove, cut down to size, and wedged it into the joint he had marked in chalk the night before. He tapped it once more. The tone dropped by half, lower, softer, almost gone. "Run it again!" Ben shouted. The fan throttle opened. The wind howled louder. The floor trembled. The monitors flickered. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the peak to leap back. But this time the spike on the graph collapsed, falling flat until the line was almost silent. 2 minutes, the timekeeper said softly, almost reverently. The bay was strangely quiet despite the roaring fan. The frame no longer sang. It only hummed, solid and steady. Ben wiped chalk from his hands and stepped back. "It's done," he said, breathless but calm. "You can push to max. It won't come back." Helm hesitated for a second, then gestured to the technician. "Full power." The fan screamed to maximum velocity. The frame shook, but not dangerously. No pitch, no rattle, no shriek. The spike never returned. The graph was flat, like a heart finding its rhythm again. 1 minute left, the timekeeper said, but no one moved. The fans wound down. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then, someone near the back whispered, "He killed it." The whisper spread until even the sponsor rep was nodding, stunned. Helm crossed to Ben. His expression was unreadable. For a moment it seemed he might speak, but instead he turned to the entire room. "You have just witnessed the most expensive 5 minutes of this department's year," Helm said, his voice steady, "and it was worth every second." Ben let out the breath he'd been holding since the test began. He gathered his notebook, slid the hammer back into its loop. His 5 minutes were up, but the silence that followed was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of respect. "Tomorrow," Helm said, turning back to him, "you show the entire department exactly how you found it. Step by step." Ben nodded. This time his voice didn't tremble. "Tomorrow," he said, "I make the frame sing for everyone." The next morning, the tunnel bay was transformed. The scaffold lights blazed white, bright enough to make the chalk marks glow like stars. Folding chairs had been brought in, lining both sides of the room. Students filled them first, then postdocs, then professors. Even the dean was there, standing near the back, his hands clasped behind him. Ben stood beside the frame, hammer resting on the console, notebook open. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. This wasn't just a test anymore, it was a trial. Professor Helm's voice broke the silence. "Yesterday, this student located and neutralized a resonance that had cost us 2 blades and weeks of progress. Today, he will show you how he found it." Ben took a breath, then walked to the whiteboard. His hand left a faint trail of chalk dust as he drew the outline of the frame. "Every girder has a pitch," he said. "Hit here." He tapped the side brace lightly with the hammer, letting the note ring through the room. "And you get G sharp. Here." Another tap, a lower sound. "E. But this one—" He pointed to the center beam. "Rang too long." He tapped it. Clink. The sound was bright, sharp, hanging in the air like a bell. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "That's what cracked your blades," Ben said simply. Helm nodded toward the technician. "Show them." The fan throttled up, wind howling through the tunnel. The FFT display came alive, and there, as clear as a lighthouse on a foggy coast, the spike shot upward. Gasps rippled through the room. This time, no one could deny it. The data was there for all to see. Ben stepped forward, wedged the strip of rubber into the joint with a single sure motion, and tapped once more. The note fell lower, dull, almost inaudible. "Run it again," he said. The spike collapsed. The room went quiet except for the roar of the fan, now steady, harmless. When the fan wound down, the dean spoke first. "This data was being smoothed?" he asked, his voice like a gavel. A graduate student in the back rose slowly, shame-faced. "Yes, I was told to filter out transient peaks before submission. The sponsor wanted clean charts." The sponsor representative stiffened. "That is not—" But Helm cut him off. "It was, and it was wrong. This department was built to find truth, not to paint over it." Ben wiped the chalk dust from his palms and spoke quietly. "The frame was never silent. We just stopped listening." The dean looked around the room. Effective immediately, the report will be revised with the raw data. No smoothing, no omissions. There was a murmur of agreement. One professor stood, then another, until nearly the whole room was on their feet. A slow, deliberate applause began. Not the quick cheer of celebration, but the deep clap of respect. Helm turned back to Ben. Yesterday I gave you 5 minutes to prove yourself. Today I give you something harder. He walked to the console, picked up a white badge, and held it out. Welcome to the team. For a moment, Ben didn't move. Then he stepped forward and took it, his fingers leaving chalk prints on the smooth plastic. That night, long after the room had emptied, Ben stayed behind. He climbed the scaffold one last time and tapped the beam gently. The F rang back, faint but no longer angry, just a memory. "You sang for them," he whispered, "and they heard you." The conference hall smelled faintly of coffee and warm electronics. Rows of faculty filled the long table, postdocs lined the back wall, and the sponsor representatives sat in the front row with tablets open. Ben sat near the end, badge clipped to his jacket for the first time. His hammer and notebook were on the table before him like tokens of proof. At the center stood the department chair, holding a printed report. "We are here to address the results of yesterday's demonstration," he said. "The resonance fault was real, and it was neutralized before our eyes. The data we published last quarter was incomplete." A low murmur ran around the room, professors exchanging glances, sponsor reps shifting uncomfortably. Professor Helm stepped forward. His face was as severe as ever, but there was no defensiveness in his stance. "I signed those smoothed reports," he said plainly. "I told this boy to stay out of my lab, and I was wrong about the data and about him." He turned to Ben. "You heard what none of us heard, and you made us face it. You saved us from losing another blade, maybe the whole tunnel." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the chair nodded slowly. "Let the record show that this project will be refiled with unfiltered data, and that discovery credit for the fault diagnosis will include..." He glanced at the badge on Ben's chest. "Ben Alvarez, invited observer and contributor." There was a silence, then a smattering of applause. Not the hesitant kind, but measured and deliberate, as though every clap was a vote in favor of truth. The sponsor representative stood. "Professor Helm, the board will have questions about the delay, but we can no longer dispute the finding. We would rather lose a quarter than lose integrity." Helm inclined his head. "Then we agree." When the meeting adjourned, Ben stayed behind, running his fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood. Helm came up beside him, holding something small. A key. "Lab 3B, Helm said, setting it gently on Ben's notebook. "Clearance for after-hours work. Use it wisely." Ben looked down at the key, then back at Helm. "I can come back." Helm nodded once. "Not just come back. Contribute." That evening, Ben returned to the tunnel bay alone. The frame stood quiet, still marked faintly with chalk, like constellations left after a storm. He climbed halfway up the scaffold and sat, badge cool against his chest. For the first time, he wasn't there to fight for a place. He was there because he belonged. "You're part of the team now," he whispered to the steel. "And so am I." The tunnel bay was empty except for the soft hiss of cooling fans and the echo of Ben's footsteps. The overhead lights had been dimmed, leaving only a golden glow near the center frame. Ben climbed halfway up the scaffold and sat on the lowest step, badge clipped to his jacket. It still felt strange against his chest. Cool, heavy, official. His hammer rested across his knees, and his notebook lay open beside him, showing the map of the frame's voice he had drawn by hand. A pair of boots appeared on the floor below. Ben looked down and saw his father standing there, cap in his hands. You didn't tell me you'd be speaking in front of all of them, his father said. I didn't know until yesterday, Ben replied. His voice was quieter than usual, as if the whole bay might be listening. His father climbed the first few steps and sat next to him. For a moment, they just looked at the frame together. The steel beams faintly glowing under the last of the work lights. You know, his father said slowly, when I was your age, I was never allowed past that yellow line. He pointed to the safety stripe on the floor. I welded these frames and scrubbed their ladders, but when the test started, we had to clear the floor. We were the noise they wanted gone. Ben touched the badge. Now we're the ones who listen for the noise. His father chuckled softly, but there was pride in it. Ben flipped open the notebook, showing his father the constellation of chalk marks he'd sketched. Every joint has its own note, he said, like a choir. If one sings too loud, you have to quiet it down or the whole thing shakes apart. His father nodded slowly. Same with people, he said. One voice out of tune, you don't throw it away. You teach it how to sing with the rest. Ben stared at the page, tracing one of the circles with his finger. I just didn't want to be the noise they threw out. You weren't noise, his father said firmly. You were the one listening when everyone else had gone deaf. They sat there a long time, the bay growing quieter until the only sound was the faint tick of metal cooling. Finally, Ben closed the notebook. Tomorrow we start retesting with the new settings. I want to map every girder, every frequency. If it ever starts singing again, we'll catch it before it cracks anything. His father smiled, slow and proud. That's how good mechanics keep a ship alive. Listen every day, not just when it's screaming. When they stood to leave, Ben hesitated near the frame, pressing his hand to the cold steel. You're quiet tonight, he said softly. Guess that means we did right by you. His father put a hand on his shoulder. You did more than fix it. You taught them to hear again. For the first time in weeks, Ben felt the weight lift from his chest. He walked out of the bay beside his father, not behind him, the two of them leaving in step, as equals. The final test day dawned with a pale, steel-blue sky, the kind of morning that made every sound seem sharper. When Ben arrived at the tunnel bay, the whole team was already there. Students, professors, postdocs, even custodians who had come on their own time. The new blade was mounted. The rubber damper Ben had placed was replaced with a permanent solution. The frame gleamed where the chalk had been scrubbed away, but Ben still remembered every mark by heart. Professor Helm stood near the console, sleeves rolled up, as though this was a ceremony more than a test. Full power when ready, he said. The fan started with a low growl, building into a deep, steady roar. Everyone's eyes went to the FFT display. Ben stood with his hands behind his back, badge catching the overhead light. At 15 meters per second, the frame stayed silent. At 20, still nothing. The graph was clean. At full speed, the tunnel sang only with the sound of rushing air. No false note, no resonance. Helm exhaled and stepped back from the console. Stable, he said quietly. Someone near the back began to clap, then another, until the whole bay filled with applause, not raucous, not giddy, steady, deliberate, like a salute. Ben didn't bow. He simply nodded once, the smallest of smiles tugging at the corner of his mouth. When the fans wound down and the bay fell silent, Helm turned to the class. This frame was our greatest problem, he said. Now it is our greatest teacher. Remember what you saw here, that listening is not passive. It is the hardest work we do. He looked at Ben. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that saves us. After the others filed out, Ben stayed behind. The bay felt different now. Not tense, not hostile, but peaceful. He walked slowly to the whiteboard, picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 3 words in block letters. Listen first, fix second. He set the chalk down and stood back, reading it one last time. His father appeared in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Done?" he asked. Ben nodded. "For now." They walked out together, side by side. The overhead lights clicked off behind them, leaving the frame in shadow. And in that quiet, the machine seemed almost to breathe, not broken, not angry, not ignored, just waiting. If you stayed with Ben all the way to this moment, thank you. In a world that moves too fast, you chose to stop and listen. And maybe that's the lesson. Machines, like people, only stay broken when no one takes the time to hear them. If this story reminded you of your father's shop, a job you once had, or a moment when someone finally heard you, share it with someone who needs that reminder today. And if you want more stories like this, about ordinary hands doing extraordinary work, subscribe and stay with us. Because as long as someone is listening, there will always be another story to tell.